Alright, so this video is in response to Sabrina's question today, asking about basically how can we switch between two different data sets, two different lists. I'm going to answer that part of it, and then I think the rest of her question, which is kind of about making new buttons to add to the book list or subtract from the book list, I think it'll become clear. So I'm going to show you my personal approach, but there's a ton of different ways to do this, but this is the way that I'm doing it. So just to show you that it works, I'm going to hit play. There's a few little bugs that I need to work out with the text. I want this button to switch from switch to books to switch to movies whenever I click it, but it doesn't actually change the text here. I just need to work on that a little bit more. But here we have the books list, and that's the movies list, and as we click it, it jumps back and forth, and we can just keep doing this all day long, and it should retain that data. So sorry, my cat's going to be yelling throughout this video. Just to kind of quickly go over what we have. I actually don't like this presentation mode. There we go. So we have, I added some comments here, and I'm going to post this code. And like I said, this probably isn't going to be like, you really can't like copy and paste this code and get it to just work immediately. So you'll have to work a little bit about fixing this to your specific use case, but I'll talk about it conceptually. So I added the UI TableView data source superclass up here. We did this last class, and then I have some variables that I made. I have one that's a Boolean books loaded. So this is checking are we loading the books or not. And then we have an integer. That's what I'm using right now just because I find that to be the simplest for books or movies. And this is going to be for a switch case of how this button works. Now, theoretically, I could have two separate buttons and each one has their own function, but I'm trying to make it a little bit quicker. And also, I threw this together in like 20 minutes, so I just want to, I'm going to go with whatever my first instinct was. So then I have our data set variables. So I have data for movies, and I got a bunch of movies listed here. Data for books, and I got a bunch of books listed here. Then I have outlets. I have a title label, which I don't think I actually ever use. I have the label for the button, which again is a little bit buggy right now. I'll work on that. And then I have a table view outlet, right? So just our typical outlets. Then I have the viewDid load. viewDid load looks exactly like it did in class. We just need to set the data source to self. That's just something that needs to happen right whenever the application loads, or else the table view won't load into properly. So below that, we have the protocol functions. So these are the functions that we have to have if we're using a UI table view data source protocol. So we have that first one. Remember what the first one does? It returns an integer that sets the number of rows for our table view. I'm going to cover this in a little bit. And then we have this one, which just returns the data for the cells. All right, let's skip over all of that for now, and I'm going to hop down to what is happening whenever the button is pressed, because that is going to inform what happens up here. So whenever the button's pressed, I have a switch. Books or movies, which this starts out at case 1, so it's an integer of 1. And at case 1, it'll say load books, basically. So set that Boolean to true, and you'll see how that comes into play a little bit. Add 1 to books or movies, which means that now that books or movies value that we're using as the switch is now equal to 2 and not 1. So next time we click it, it'll do this one, so it'll switch back. So that's how we're switching it back and forth, is for adding 1 here. Then I have the classic reloading the data, which just reloads everything so that it visually updates. And then here's where I have a little bit of a bug going on, where this text should switch to movies. I'm just going to remove that for now. I'm thinking it has to do with how I have this label set up. All right, so that the second part of this, the case 2, does the same thing, but just the opposite. So instead of setting books loaded to true, it sets it to false. And instead of adding to books or movies, it subtracts 1. So it takes from case 2 back to case 1. So each time we click this, it's either adding 1 or subtracting 1. So it's jumping back and forth between these two. Remember, we also need to have a default case. And in that case, I just put break. Somehow, if this equaled 0, it would just break, which means it would stop my program from running. That's the traditional way to end a switch statement. So keep that in mind, that the only thing we're really changing is this Boolean from true or the Boolean to false, and we're adding 1 to the case or subtracting 1 from the case. That's all that's happening. Let's go back up to these functions. So let's take this one function at a time. So this is the rows function. So if we're loading the books, right? So if we've clicked that button, or if we haven't clicked that button, sorry, if it's equal to false, so we use two equal signs, it's an equivalency check. If it is equivalent to false, then return the data from movies.count, meaning however many items I have in data from movies, which I think is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, return that number 5 out here. So send that to my table view and make that many rows. If books loaded is equal to true, meaning we clicked that button, see books loaded is equal to true, then we're going to return the data for books.count instead of the data for movies.count, which I think I only have, 3 books up here. We do have to have this else return 0. This is basically like the default case. So we have to have a default that returns in case for some reason these don't load their data properly. So I just have else return 0. So that's never going to actually occur because we always have this set to false or always have it set to true, and it's just swapping back and forth between those two. So then the next part is the data loading, which can be a little bit complicated at first, but I think it'll make sense as we go on. So if we compare the data loading in our original project, so let me just pull that up real quick. And of course my Slack isn't open. So let's pop open the original code that I wrote yesterday. So in that code we have, this is what the loading looks like. So we have let my cell equals TableView, DQ, and then we have to have this name match the prototype name that we gave it in here, right? We identified this prototype cell. Where is that? It's hard to click. To cell in TableView over here. So we have to have that identifier. All right, that's normal. So that can be outside of all these if statements. All right, so here's those if statements. So that can be outside of that because that's going to happen every time that this table view is loaded, right? Every time we want this to be consistently loaded, saying, hey, grab that cell and start putting data into it. Then we have two if statements. We have if books loaded is equivalent to false, then go grab the text from my data for movies. So if we're loading the movies, grab this text, load one into each row, into each cell in each row, and display that, basically. That's all we're doing here with the my cell text label.text equals holder text. So all that's saying is, here's if we are not loading books, load movie text, put it into holder text. If the books loaded is equivalent to true, I have a different constant. So I have holder text 1 over here and holder text 2 over here. Let the holder text 2 equal the data for books. So this one's data for movies, this one's data for books. Same thing, load it into each row and change the label to equal holder text 2. So here's holder text 1, holder text 2. So holder text 2 is holding all of our book names. Holder text 1 is holding all of our movie names. And then we're just loading those into cells. The last thing, since we're doing this either state, it doesn't need to be within these if statements. I can just say return my cell. Remember, I need to have that exclamation point there because the my cell has to be unwrapped. I think we had, oh no, I don't think it was the same in our test code, but basically it's the same thing where we have to tell it, yeah, we're going to have data in our cell, otherwise it would crash. Okay, so that's really the whole thing is how we're going to switch back and forth. So each time we click it, it's going to change a Boolean, and you could have a Boolean, you could have a number, you could have any number of different ways of doing this. This is just the simple way that I just came up with off the top of my head. So yeah, that's basically it. I'll hit play and we'll show it again. So as we click, switching back and forth. Now you can incorporate, I'm sure you'll be able to incorporate this into your project. And this data should stay consistent. So if I add to this, it's going to stay consistent, switching back and forth, or if I remove entries from this. All right, hope that answers your question.